Hi, everybody. This is acyuta-bhava from Nightlight Astrology. It is Monday, February 10th, and today I'm making a video after receiving a question from one of my viewers. So actually, this question comes from a student who's also a viewer. And the question is, how can we think about essential dignities, what they are, why they're useful, and the appropriate way of using them? And this question actually came up after something of public controversy in the professional astrology realm online. Over the weekend, apparently there was a professional astrologer. I do not know him. I don't know his work. I don't know him personally at all. So, but this is the story. Who came out in a video and said that the language of essential dignities was sort of outdated BS. And his reasoning for saying this was that he believes that, or he had been receiving, I guess, comments or questions from some of his audience saying, am I kind of screwed because I have, say, Venus in Aries or Mercury in Pisces or Jupiter in Capricorn, placements that are either a planet said to be a planet's detriment or its fall. And he said, first of all, that's BS. You're not screwed. And then he went a step further and said, and that entire language is just sort of outdated crap. So he got a lot of applause on the one hand from people who very understandably don't want a planet in their chart to be like, oh, look how screwed you are, look how bad you are, something like that. Look how hopeless you are. So I think I can completely empathize with that. First of all, that's not the way that the language of essential dignity was ever meant to be used, nor does using it in that way reflect any degree of care or sensitivity for the soul of the person that we're working with. So agreed. I would agree with him. I think most astrologers would agree with him that if you use the language of essential dignity as a way of making a person feel hopeless or condemned or pigeonholed, something like that, that it's really harmful. So that's number one. I think everyone could agree with his first point. But then he went a step further, which was to say that all the language of essential dignities is BS. To which he got some real kickback. And my understanding, not having followed this closely, I was out of town, so I really only heard about it through a student of mine. There was some real kickback from people saying, hey, look, it's not the language itself, it's how you use it. And to which apparently, again, this is not something I followed or seen at all, but apparently he stepped it back and issued kind of an apology saying, you're right, there's more to this language than meets the eye, and I'll be sure to talk about that in future posts or something like that. So, but then these kinds of conversations can have ripple effects, and lots of people can start kind of scratching their heads going like, well, wait, why does this language exist? What does it mean? How should it be used? And this is what I received from my student. Could you clarify? So I said, okay, I'll try to do that in a brief video. It's a tall task to do in a short video, but let's just discuss briefly. In ancient astrology, all of the language of essential dignities basically works like this. All of the planets have signs that they were said at the beginning of the cosmos to have familiarized themselves with. This is the way that one of my teachers, Robert Schmidt, described it. He was one of the great translators and philosophers of the last century in modern astrology, who also translated a huge bulk of the source texts of Hellenistic astrology into English. And so each planet was said to have familiarized themselves with one of the signs and the sign with the planet, so that a sign resembles a planet and a planet resembles a sign. And you have, for each of the planets, you have a yin sign and a yang sign. You can call them feminine and masculine, but these are energetic, metaphysical, archetypal qualities, not meant to be mistaken with literal genders or literal sexes. And so when we have planets like Venus, who will have one masculine and one feminine, or one active, passive, or one yang and one yin sign, like Libra being the more active, yang or masculine, and Taurus being the more passive or receptive, yin or feminine. So every planet gets two signs that are said to be their home signs. The sun and the moon each have one sign, and there are some very elaborate and very specific metaphysical explanations behind why the sun and the moon only have one sign and all the rest of the planets have two. I can't go into that right now. But every planet will be like that, will have a home sign. So when any modern astrologer, for example, today is using rulerships, they're saying this planet rules that sign. They're using the language of essential dignities. The phrase essential dignities is a later term. You don't see that phrase being used in the earliest Hellenistic source texts. They're not talking about a list of like, well, this planet is screwed here and really awesome here. That's not at all how they talk about it. For example, in Rhetorius, one of the famous texts that has a deep explanation of the essential dignities, Rhetorius says that these are the exaltations and contrarieties of the stars, the wandering stars, the planets. And what he means by that is that there are a series of archetypal tensions in the way that the zodiac was conceptualized and explained by the original seers and mystics who received it. It was thought to be a transkarmic language as well, which is a way of saying that it's a language that is archetypal and eternal, just like the tarot or the Kabbalah that it has, or the I Ching, that it has. It comes from. It's a kind of ideal, almost like mathematical type of language. It's like like an ancient mystical version of a physics model. It's a model of the universe, of reality, and more than anything, it's a language. So the basic idea behind the dignities is that when any planet is traveling through the signs of the zodiac, it will either be in one of its own home places where it is most capable of acting and behaving like itself. So for example, Venus loves peace, beauty, harmony, sensuality, desire, even lust, lots of stuff, right? There's a whole Venusian kind of world. And when in Libra or when in Taurus, you get its sort of active or more receptive expression. It has both. And when it's in either of those home signs, it's also able to behave Venus most like itself. And when Venus is behaving most like itself, there is no filtering through the lens or tension or dialogue with any other planets. It's just like you or me being in a house or a home or a wardrobe or an outfit that is most essentially me. Whereas sometimes I might have to go to some kind of formal event or function or a party or something like that, and I've kind of got to dress the part and play along or kind of shapeshift a little bit, right? And sometimes that can really deeply compromise something essential about who I am and what I want and what I do. And other times, and so then, it's basically up to me, like, well, how am I going to handle that? It's like, I'm a pretty liberal guy. So what would happen if you threw me into like a super conservative Southern Baptist church on a Sunday right now? I'd be out of my element, right? So planetary dignities are telling us the essential nature of a planet and then how it tends to behave or get along with another planet by virtue of being in that other planet's sign or house. The ancient word for a house was the same as a sign. So the Cancer is the house of the moon. Leo is the house of the sun. So if you take Venus and put Venus in the house of the sun, then what's happening, Venus and Leo, for example, if you have Venus and Leo, then what you're saying is that Venus is still going to behave and act essentially like Venus. That's the essential nature of the planet. But then you have to filter that expression through being in the house of the sun. So that means Venus is going to be like Venus, but then there's different ways of conceptualizing it. You could say that Venus is expressing Venus's own nature through the lens of solar archetypal properties or qualities. And so it's a kind of blending when you describe them. On the other hand, you could say that Venus's expression in the sign of Leo is akin to being a house guest. Venus is a guest in the domicile of the sun, the house of the sun. And so as the house guest, Venus will, as the rules of etiquette in the ancient world demanded, and this is a part of many sacred cultures all over the world, in the East and the West, all over, in South Central America, like everywhere. When you have a guest in your home, you treat them as if they're a god. You treat them as if they're an angel. You treat them as if they could be a god in disguise. You treat them with all respect. And one of the things you do is you provide for them. And this is sort of the guest host dynamic in the ancient world, which is also why the word ruler, a later word that comes in to describe the Greek word oikodespotes, which actually has more of the connotation of being like a host or a steward, is not the best word to use. Ruler is not really a good word to use. If I go over to your house, are you ruling me? Well, not really. You're my host, and hopefully we're friendly. So when Venus is in Leo, Venus is the guest and the sun is the host. So what ancient astrologers were getting at was that if Venus is in Leo, then Leo, the sun, must provide for Venus. Well, if Venus wants peace and Venus wants beauty and sensuality, let's say, if Venus wants amazing colors and textures and vibrancy and happiness, creativity, different things that Venus likes, then the sun has to provide. And what does the sun provide Venus with? Well, maybe something that's a bit more royal, or something that is golden, or something Venus or Leo may provide something that is more theatrical and pronounced, like a king or a queen or something like that. So there's a lot of ways that you could end up describing how the sun provides for Venus, but it's also not that simple, because at any given time, the sun can only provide for Venus based on wherever the sun is located in the zodiac, by house and by sign and by its own dignity. And so it becomes a really subtle science of understanding how one planet like Venus is in Leo and is needing something to behave and act like herself in the home of another planet, herself, himself, itself. And then the sun provides, but the sun can only provide based on the sun's position. So in turn, if you were to have a debilitated sun in a bad house, or in a house that provides more challenges, and there are very deep, beautiful reasons why the challenges of each house are what they are. Most people think of the houses, they just think of a list of topics. And in modern astrology, they think that the topics of the houses come from affiliation with the signs, which is not at all the case. In ancient astrology, the meanings of the houses are generated from a very deep astronomical rationale that's actually really, really beautiful, and it's insanely like intelligent. So the reason that the 12th house is difficult, but also being able to understand what the potential virtues or benefits of the 12th house are, has really nothing to do with Pisces, which is what a lot of people think. But at any rate, this is a digression. The point is that if the sun were providing for Venus and Leo, and the sun were to be in a difficult position of any kind, then that's going to further your qualify the interpretation of specifically what the sun is providing Venus with, while Venus is a house guest. And this study teaches you how to start seeing the planets in a web, in a dialogue, filtering one archetypal influence through the lens of another, what to speak of the houses and the aspects that end up getting involved. And in ancient astrology, all levels of the language are interconnected. So although modern astrologers rightly suggest that this language it feels sort of prescriptive when you're seeing words like detriment or fall or whatever, the language is not at all prescriptive when used intelligently, because it's a deeply intelligent language. And to discard it would be like saying, I've never really studied classical acupuncture, but let me throw it out and just start sticking needles in people wherever I want because I feel like I'm wiser than they were thousands of years ago. That's called appropriation, in any other language, right? And it would be the same thing if we did that with Ayurveda. We're like, well, 2,000 years ago in India, there was some really backward thinking about class or caste system or whatever, so throw out Ayurveda. It's like, well, that's not so intelligent. And if we believe that there are ways in which a language needs to be adapted to modern times, right? Because we have changed. And we have to think about that very carefully after first having done really deep, thorough, careful research and understanding of where the entire language comes from and the way it was built and why it was built that way, which it turns out is not really that ignorant, but is actually pretty brilliant. So that's an aside, a little soapbox there. I apologize. Okay, so back to the dignities. So a planet has dignity, its basic meaning is that a planet is wanting to always behave like itself. And if you place a planet in another sign, it's going to behave through the filter of the planet whose house it is in. And then what happens is there are special categories that we have for when a planet is also in a position that may be more challenging or difficult in terms of expressing its own essential nature. So, for example, every single planet is always debilitated in the sign that is exactly opposite to its own sign. For example, if you take the moon in Cancer, that's its home sign. Put it in the opposite sign of Capricorn, and that is the sign of its exile or detriment. If you take the sun and put it in the polar opposite sign of Aquarius, that is its exile or detriment. Now, the word detriment is actually also a later word. The original word in Greek is closer to what you or I would, the word exile. Exile, meaning that you're out of your home territory. Exile means that you are in exile from your homeland or from a home space. Maybe you've been kicked out. Maybe you've chosen to leave. It's kind of open, but there's deep, beautiful rationale behind this, and it has to do with the inherent contrarieties of the stars, which is part of an elaborate model that ancient astrologers had of understanding archetypal interactions, tensions, and harmonies between planets and the archetypes that they represented. So, for example, when you take Venus, whose natural home is Taurus and Libra, and in those signs, we say Venus can most naturally express itself, masculine or feminine, active or passive, etc., and any spectrum in between, easily, right? And more easily. Just like it's easier for you or I in our own home environment to sort of be ourselves. We can lounge around in our pajamas, and so it's just easier. And some would say stronger, maybe. Stronger, not always the best word, though. Now, take Venus and put Venus in the polar opposite signs. Those are the signs of Mars. Put Venus in Aries, opposite Libra. Put Venus in Scorpio, opposite Taurus. And now you have Venus in Mars's signs. That's because Venus's signs are always opposite to Mars's signs, and Mars's signs are opposite to Venus's signs. This is intentional on the part of ancient astrologers. And that is because Venus and Mars have natural oppositional they have a contrariety, and that's pretty obvious. Mars is war and Venus is peace. Mars is action, and Venus is going to be more receptive and responsive. Mars is going to be more about, say, going and getting something with your will. Venus is more about attracting something to you through more of a centripetal force. Mars more centrifugal. So, and so many other ways that you can talk about them. But of course, the two are opposite to one another because they also share in a secret sameness. This is the basic meaning of oppositions in ancient astrology in general. And that's it's elaborate and more than I have time to explain, but it comes from Platonic and Pythagorean thinking, which is highly musical. It's very beautiful. It's where Carl Jung derived a lot of his work in the modern era. And essentially, Mars and Venus being opposites with one another means that, when Venus is in Mars's sign, it's like my wife has Venus in Aries, right, in her 10th house of work. She could tell you right away that, she was running a yoga studio, and the yoga studio is very beautiful, right? It's Venusian. It's very peaceful. It's quiet music. It's relaxing. It's a place that you go. There was a lot of women's groups, and very open and harmonizing to people from all over the community that get to feel welcome. And this is but my wife also struggled to relax and to enjoy or partake in that herself, because she was managing and running the whole business. And so the warrior, the pioneer, the entrepreneur, the martial, aggressive, competitive dynamic in her always was feeling some degree of tension and conflict within when it came to what she was actually trying to create, which was something more Venusian. So when we say that Venus in her chart is in exile, what we mean is that it's a house guest of Mars. And that means that Venus is going to want peace, and Mars is like, okay, I'll give you peace, as an entrepreneur who's going to, kick butt and be really aggressive and sometimes struggle to be peaceful. You know what I mean? So um, the language of dignities on the basic level of domicile and detriment, or domicile and exile, is only ever describing the tensions inherent in archetypal opposites. And the language itself really shouldn't be used with a client unless they already have an understanding of or appreciation of this language, because otherwise it can be misconstrued and someone can think that this means that they're, oh, you have Venus in detriment. And rightly, like, this astrologer was pretty ticked off. This astrologer was like, I'm not going to stand for that, because then people come away thinking there's something wrong with them. And so if the language is being used, be like, oh, you have Venus in detriment, you're screwed. That's not right, right? And it's not the way that ancient astrologers constructed the language even. So, but it does mean something. It doesn't mean nothing. It is valid and legitimate because of the way that the zodiac is constructed, to understand that domiciles and detriments, or domiciles and exiles, have to do with feeling most like yourself, and then feeling like you have to compromise with your polar opposite looking at you in the mirror. And that's what the exile relationship is about. So for example, if you take Mars and put Mars into Libra, you have people like John Lennon, who is described as a bully, but who was also described as someone who was relentlessly fighting for peace. It's a funny thing, like John Lennon was described as someone who was really abrasive and kind of self-centered, vain, and kind of bullying. But he was also described by biographers and his collaborators in the Beatles and so forth as someone who did not like pretentiousness, and basically, made it a goal to fight for peace. So he had a complicated relationship between being a martial personality. He was an Aries rising, if I remember correctly, but having Mars in the seventh house in Libra, which is to say that he had a natural, like, aggressive warrior personality, but he was being served by the domicile ruler of Libra, so the home temple of Venus, saying, "I'll tell you what, you want to fight? Let me give you the Vietnam War to fight about. You know what I mean? Let me give you the bed-in, or let me give you the sense of being just being against the man, in the 60s, that was trying to tell young people how to think, how to act, how to dress. That's complicated, though. He ends up being killed very violently, for example, by a crazed fan. Um, he is sort of Mars was originally the archetype associated with martyrs, people who would die for a cause. Sometimes that's there with Mars in Taurus or Mars in Libra. You have similar qualities in Adolf Hitler, Mars in Taurus, where he has this idea of this golden age and this golden race and this golden people, and all this stuff is very idealistic, very utopian, very Venusian. And yet he wants to go about establishing that in the world through mass murder, which is, of course, god awful. So the and obviously not everyone who has Mars in Taurus is going to be Hitler, right? And not everyone with Mars in Libra is going to be John Lennon. But the point is that we're talking about an inherent archetypal tension in the life of an individual that will play out in some particular area of their life, and represent the difficulties of synthesizing planetary opposites. So that's what detriment and domicile mean. The next thing that we need to say is that in ancient astrology, the language of dignities is not meant to describe you. In fact, the birth chart is not meant to describe you. The birth chart is meant to describe the conditions in which you, as a spirit soul who are eternal and beyond what any birth chart could ever describe, are living in. And so, first of all, the fundamental belief behind astrology, like the Constitution of the United States of America, is that each person is created equal. Each person is an immutable, eternal, spiritual being. And we are traveling through human experiences, animal experiences, unlimited cosmic experiences, and different planets even. You should see what Indian astrologers wrote about. It's wild. It's like science fiction. And so the chart is in Indian astrology, you could say it's like your kshetra. It's a field. It's describing the karma or the karmic conditions that you are surrounded by in and through which you are traveling. Nobody should, nobody should be unfamiliar with this concept, right? I am not what has happened to me. I am not what is happening to me or what will happen to me. I am the person choosing how to respond. Or you could say it another way. You could say that I participate in the making of meaning relative to whatever cards are dealt to me in this lifetime. So, for example, some people are born, with really difficult karmic circumstances, and some are born seemingly with amazing good luck. It's like some people seem to win the lottery in terms of being provided for with loving parents, and others seem to, come into life just getting smacked around by the time they're little with parents that are abusive. The language of ancient astrology is not meant to describe who a person is. Who we are is something that's in the making. Who we are is endless. Who we are can't be described or defined or contained by a birth chart. In fact, I tell my students all the time, try to release the possessive, my Venus, my Mars, my Saturn, etc., because all this is doing is reinforcing a conflation of your sense of who you are with the birth chart. And you're not the birth chart. That's not you. In modern astrology, when we use the birth chart psychologically to describe features or facets of the psyche, as though the chart is just the psyche, just the soul or the personality, one potential unintended bad consequence of doing that is that we start to think that we are a set of very limiting descriptions, whether you're very, very positive or you're very, very negative. It doesn't matter. The inherent use of a birth chart in ancient astrology has more to do with describing the conditions of life, from the psychology, from the body to the parents, the family, the spouse, to money, to children, to pregnancy, to different limbs and organs of the body, to your jobs and your religious experiences and travel experiences and friends and siblings, and right. So each of us, from the standpoint of ancient astrology, is a spirit soul. And the language of dignities, when we say this planet is afflicted in this sign, or it's really exalted or happy in this sign, or whatever, that is a relative language that is meant to describe the conditions of life. But very clearly, ancient astrologers believed, and it's very clear in the delineation texts, that exalted planets, for example, that seem really good can indicate something really bad. And a debilitated planet can indicate something really good, even though it seems really bad. This is because we have to know how to use the language within the context of a lot of other factors in the chart. The language doesn't exist in a vacuum, and the language is not purely a language of good and bad on some moral or absolute level. For example, a well-dignified planet could describe someone who's very powerful, but they're a tyrant. A poorly dignified planet could describe someone who has fallen on hard times, but it has produced within them a spirit of compassion or charity. So it's a very relative language, but the primary purpose of the language is to describe the conditions in which the soul, the spirit soul, is living in, not who or what the spirit soul is, which can only be discovered, by the way, in ancient astrology through the constant contemplation of what we are in contrast to what we experience. This is in modern terms why we have therapy, or why we, why we might go to a yoga class and meditate, or go for a run to like just process and reflect and recalibrate and deepen our sense of who we are in relation to the conditions of life. But if we were to take away the ability of the language to describe the conditions of life in consensus material reality and replace it with purely positivistic language, we'd be doing ourselves a great disservice, because it turns out that the material world is really, it's uneven. On the spiritual level, we're all equal, right? On the spiritual level, we're all created equal. We could say, like the Constitution says, we're all spirit souls who have equal dignity and equal worth as, literally in the Indian conception, energies of God. But in this material world that we live in, things are not always just, things are not always fair, and we're not on even ground with one another. Some people are born being able to run faster than others. Some people are born more naturally good at mathematics and able to become an engineer. Some are more inclined to being amazing with colors and art. Some people can speak really well or inspire others. Other people work in ways that are less, in the public eye. Some people are, born into families that are really wealthy, and some that are really poor. Some are poor in spirit, some are rich in spirit. You know what I mean? So we have to be able to describe the relative world of karma, fate, and destiny that we're born into. And every soul inherits a very different karmic story. The language of dignities is helping us to more accurately but sensitively describe those conditions. However, what makes an astrologer a good astrologer is their ability to honestly describe conditions while not killing a person's spirit, and while helping a person understand how any condition whatsoever can be an opportunity for spiritual growth, or for deeper personal development, for the deepening of compassion, for the deepening of spiritual community, etc. So that's why we can't do away with the language of dignities. The language of dignities is something that dignity is a meaningless concept if we can't say that it needs to be maintained in the face of a world that often wants to strip us of it, right? So the world that we're living in, the conditions of where things are not always equal, and where there are injustices and there are ups and there are downs, that world is the karmic language that astrology is. Astrology is a karmic language meant to describe that world. And it does so through good and bad houses in ancient astrology. It does so through good and bad sign placements in ancient astrology. But good and bad, you have to understand that even for ancient astrologers, good and bad were very relative. And we can see this quite literally in the writings of the ancient astrologers. Let me pause and show you, for example. Okay, so here is just a few a few quotes that I think, people might like, because it kind of helps. Those who engage in the prediction of the future and the truth, having acquired a soul that is free and not enslaved, do not think highly of fortune. Now, fortune is the circumstantial reality, right? The karmic reality. The circumstances around us, but not who we are. Those who engage in the prediction of the future and the truth, having acquired a soul that is free and not enslaved, do not think highly of fortune, and do not devote themselves to hope, nor are they afraid of death. But instead they live their lives undaunted by disturbance, by training their souls to be confident, and neither rejoice excessively in the case of good, nor become depressed in the case of bad, but instead are content with whatever is present. So if you've ever read the Power of Now, right? Or the power of now and being present and content doesn't work unless there's a world that's challenging us to be content. And the language of astrology is helping us describe the language, the world around us that is challenging us, from it's our own karmic inherited circumstances, as well as being part of the collective that we're in, the family that we're in, the relationships that we're in, etc. And so the language of astrology here, we have Vettius Valens telling us, is meant to train our souls to be confident that I am who I am, and my happiness is found in me not in the circumstances. But to deny that there is a language that describes those circumstances is to try to bypass those circumstances. And that's not actually a positive thing. That is a feigned kind of positivity that's actually built off from an aversion to negativity. And it's subtle, but we have to be able to take the good with the bad and we have to be able to find bliss, meaning, knowledge, truth, beauty, and goodness in all different kinds of circumstances in life. At the same time, recognizing that there is a material world in which, most people prefer, I like to say, most people prefer eating a piece of pie than having an enemy strike you in the face with one, so, so at any rate, there is, let's see. There's another quote in here somewhere, and I'm not finding it. This is from Chris Brennan's book on Hellenistic astrology, by the way. We do not shrink from dangers once foretold. By recollection of its majesty, our souls have formed themselves to withstand these things. We are not overcome by bad fortune, nor elated by promise of high office. Thus fortified by stable reason, we can't be oppressed by ill fortune or overjoyed at the expectation of good. So ancient astrologers were teaching us that your happiness really comes from within, and it comes from being in the present moment. And this language helps us describe the ups and downs specifically so that we can be aware of them and stay present while going through them, not escape from them to a cave, but be present while going through them. And sometimes the cave that we try to escape to is excessive positivity, excessive hopefulness about the future, excessive attachment to good outcomes and good things about me or you or anyone. And really what we're trying to get to in the spiritual language of ancient astrology is a sense of being comfortable with what we are and not needing to, some of the language of modern astrology sometimes has a lot to do with this feeling of you've been disempowered by circumstances, but now you can be empowered. And ancient astrology is actually going a step beyond that to say, look, circumstances can be disempowering and sometimes they can be very empowering, but don't be fooled into thinking that empowerment is what you want, because in this karmic realm, the wheel of fortune turns and turns, and those who are empowered are eventually disempowered, and those who are disempowered will eventually be empowered again. And this is a hamster wheel that's actually torturous for the self-reflective being. When you start to be deeply self-reflective, you realize that what you are needs neither some great elevation of office, some great sense of empowerment, nor do you need to despair if you go through experiences of disempowerment. That's the real empowerment. And so that's the confidence of soul that Valens talks about. And Ptolemy says, first of all, it's necessary to consider that even for events that will necessarily result, the unexpected is apt to cause delirious confusion and mad joy, while foreknowing habituates and trains the soul to attend distant events as though they were present and prepares it to accept each arriving event with peace and tranquility. Now, there's another quote, and I can't find it, it's in here somewhere, that basically says, look, the things that appear like they're going to be really good are often the things that mess people up the most. And for example, fame or success, which oftentimes goes to people's heads, and then they get really a lot of money and they start spending it on a lot of drugs, and it's not at all a good thing. Well, that might be denoted by a very positive planet in ancient astrology, and the ancient astrologers were very aware of this. And also that a debilitated planet could lead one to great fortune, because people make amazing things out of being in hard times. So there's the quote says, basically sometimes good things happen and they actually end up being really bad, and sometimes bad things happen, they end up being really good. Ancient astrologers were not unaware of these elements of fate and fortune. So sometimes when modern astrologers look back and they read this language and they don't have a deep understanding of the philosophy of Pythagoreans, of yogis, of Buddhists, of Platonists, of the people who were using this technology long ago, and it appears like, a planet in a sign is saying, oh, you're bad or you're messed up. Completely understandably, they have a reaction to it. But the downside of that reaction is that sometimes, like as the case this weekend, we'll go a step too far and we'll be like, yeah, just get rid of that. It must be some kind of unevolved or unenlightened language. And it turns out that really the only thing unenlightened about it is how you're using it. Now, it's arguable that I teach a class called Ancient Astrology for Modern Times. There are elements of ancient astrology that clearly need to be updated and repackaged for time, place, and circumstance. It was not a perfectly enlightened society, and I don't believe that the sages who received it were perfect beings or anything like that. No more than, but no more should we could say that, ancient China wasn't a brilliant place. What are we going to do? Throw out acupuncture? You know what I mean? So I believe that there's the basic ideas of ancient astrology, if understood and brought into our present moment with care and sensitivity, can really help us to go deeper and keep growing our great tradition of astrology, and so many different kinds of astrology too. And some people may not be drawn to using this language at all, and that's cool as well. I think the main thing that people were responding to in this particular debacle that took place was just the idea that, like, look, this could be used positively, or this is by many people. Now, in the language of essential dignities, there's also a category of exaltation and fall, and people oftentimes have a lot of confusion about this as well. The words sound very extreme, but what exaltation meant was that a planet was lifted on high, and what fall meant was that a planet was fallen down low and or depressed. For example, Stephen King has Mars in his first house depressed in Cancer, and that's the health house in traditional astrology. And he was literally struck by a van and thrown into a deep ravine and almost died. In ancient astrology, we would say that it's possible that the health, behavior, or psychology, all things associated with the first house in ancient astrology, would fall on hard times due to Mars being in a depressed position. Well, not only did, Stephen King fall, he was hit and almost died, but he also struggled very deeply with very reckless and impulsive behavior with drugs earlier in his life. Now, that does not mean that in every case that someone has Mars in Cancer that they will be reckless, or doesn't mean that they'll get hit by a van or anything like that. Context is everything. In Stephen King's chart, the moon is in the 6th house in Sagittarius. That modifies the interpretation. There's a lot of other things in his chart that modify the interpretation. His 5th house is Scorpio. And as a 5th house Scorpio, Mars would also tell us, and his 10th house is Aries. He was someone whose work ruled by Mars in the 10th house. Also, Mars ruling the 5th house of creativity came together, and he wrote horror novels that were really awesome. And, a lot of people have really loved them. Like, they're really like awesome pieces of artwork. But they have been about horrible, awful circumstances, and oftentimes to people who are all sorts of circumstances, like, for example, children who are faced with the overwhelm of death, Mars in the moon's sign, and in Stand By Me, or the body. A man who is falsely imprisoned after his lover is killed, domestic violence that leads to the false imprisonment, and he goes to jail for it. The Shawshank Redemption. Misery, where a man is stuck in a cabin with a crazy person, and it's a crazy mad woman. Now, elements that you can critique whether he's sexist with any of those things or not, obviously, but many of the a killer clown who goes after children, there's always some kind of deranged interaction between something lunar and something martial. Pet Cemetery, there's kids' pets that are going crazy. What's the one about the young girl who starts like Carrie, right? A lot of his literature comes from the exchange between the lunar symbolism and the martial symbolism. And the idea being that, for example, when Mars is depressed or in its fall in the moon sign, that it produces really difficult combinations. The moon is a planet that, for example, we had, I think it was last summer when Mars went into Cancer. Right away, one of the biggest headlines was a woman who was pregnant and was killed while pregnant because of someone coming to her door from like a Craigslist ad or something, and ended up killing her and trying to take her baby. Like you know what I mean? So I won't go into it, but like uh, at the same time, you'll have issues oftentimes that are about advocacy, protection, strength, courage, Mars, with regard to the innocent, the vulnerable, the earth, women, children, etc. So it's not, but we are saying that there is another kind of tension between Mars and the moon, right? You know, for example, Mars and the moon is like clipping the umbilical cord after a child is born. There's the knife, Mars, and the moon, which is the baby and the connection to the mother. There's so many different ways in which the archetypes can combine. What the meaning of Mars in Cancer in its depression traditionally meant, for example, was just that you have another kind of, like, when Mars is a house guest in the what does Mars want? Well, I know that we want to try and stay toward the more positive expressions of Mars, but that's not always true to the way that the karmic world is. Mars wants blood, Mars wants victory, Mars wants dominance, Mars wants competition, Mars is willful. And then it's like, you know, its host, the moon, is like, well, let me give you children, let me give you a mother, let me give you women, let me give you those who are vulnerable or those who are sensitive emotionally or whatever. And when that combination comes about, the idea behind the depression on some basic level is that we see a more intense, difficult, heavy interaction often. Is that all we ever see? No. Is it all bad? No. You have, I think, Michael Phelps, or I don't remember, who's a famous Olympian swimmer who has Mars in Cancer. But the idea is that you will see oftentimes a combination that is more challenging. It's like a little, it's just like a little indicator saying, oops, this one can be a little tough, you know? So for example, Mars ingressed into Cancer in my birth chart. I have the sun in Cancer, and it ingressed, and I have Mercury in Cancer, and Mercury rules the fifth house of children. So when Mars went over Mercury in Cancer, one of the things that happened was there was a really bad, huge hornet's nest outside of my house. And it was going after my kids, my dog, my wife. Like they were hostile, right? So it was this whole thing of like needing to defend and protect my house, right, from these stinging insects who had made their home on the side of the house. That's a difficult Mars, right? And then I ended up getting stung 7 times while trying to get rid of it. So that's a little bit of a Mars. So that was while Mars was going over. It first appeared when it was going over Mercury, the ruler of my fifth house of children, and they started appeared bothering my children. I was really worried. By the time it had moved deeper into Cancer and got close to my son was when I ended up getting stung, and we ended up having to have someone come out and try to remove them in a green manner. You know, it's like, so at any rate, if you flip it, Mars exalted in Capricorn, what you're talking about is a placement where Mars can do Mars-like things, and its host Saturn is providing for it in a way that's much more constructive and sort of easy and strong. So Mars wants to work, you know, dominate, be victorious, and now you've got Saturn, discipline, seriousness, stick-to-itiveness, structure, right? So you put those two together and you get a very, very sort of productive, elevated Mars. It's not that one is really inherently better than another, but it is to say that in our relative world, relatively speaking, a Moon-Mars interaction is a little bit more perilous than a Mars-Saturn interaction in Capricorn. So we use that language in order to understand something. So there's more examples of this than I can count, but you would never read it in a vacuum and just go, oh, you have Mars in Cancer, so that means something about you. That's the other thing, is that in ancient astrology, quite clearly, Mars in Cancer could be describing something that has nothing to do with you. It could be describing your boss. It could be describing your upbringing around religion. Like, for example, Mars in its fall in Cancer in the 9th house, maybe you grew up in a religion that oppressed women, right? And you grow in your life to have a deep sensitivity around that. Okay. Or maybe Mars is in Cancer in your 7th house, and, you know, you have a spouse, let's say it's a wife, who is a strong feminist and advocates for women, but also maybe lost a child to a miscarriage, right? So oftentimes, again, the language you have to be really multivalent with the language. And the delineation texts in ancient astrology are also like that. They're not just bad, good, bad. I mean, the things that these planetary placements end up describing, if you read a text like Mathesis by Firmicus Maternus and look at his delineations of different planetary placements, I mean, they're really elaborate and oftentimes not at all what you would think. So anyway, exaltations and falls also have their own inherent rationale underlying them that have to do with the seasons. For example, Mars exalted in Capricorn is because Capricorn is the gateway of the gods, and the gateway of the gods in winter is associated with the separation of the soul from the body upon death. And when the will, Mars, is wed, you could say, to the Saturnine domain that represents the need to depart from this world and go into an otherworldly space, which, believe it or not, is what Capricorn originally signified, as did Saturn. Saturn being at a distance from this world, being somewhat detached from this world. That's originally part of what Saturn meant. So when you have Mars in that wintry sign of Saturn, you can be sort of willful and detached. And when you do that, like, for example, that's how you have to, if you're going to be a Buddhist, you're going to sit like the Buddha under the Bodhi tree until you reach enlightenment. You have to have something like an exalted Mars going for you. I'm just making this up, obviously, but the idea being that the will to do something that is of transcendent value, that you need some kind of detachment and firmness and rigor to achieve something that about immortality. This is part of what Capricorn signified and why Mars is also exalted at that part of year, because you take the will of Mars and you put it in service to a transcendental, otherworldly value, and you work hard for it, which is, part of all spiritual paths on planet Earth since ever have included some degree of austerity, meaning whether you sit in a sweat lodge or you sit on your yoga mat, it's not comfortable to get real and to be present with ourselves. It's much easier to, constantly, pump ourselves up with hot air about how great we are and just try to ride that from one sense gratifying event to another. And that's not what if you wanted to develop confidence and soul, you had to really work at it. You had to work hard to be present through all the ups and downs of life. So Mars and Capricorn in some ways associated with that. Now, again, you can extrapolate in many different ways too. I'm not like the gospel on any of this stuff. I'm just giving some examples of how I've worked with the language. Then when you take Mars and flip it into its fall, it turns out that the fall of Mars in Cancer is the gateway of life, right? So Cancer was the gateway through which the soul incarnated into the body, which is why it's ruled by the moon, and also why Cancer is on the ascendant of the Thema Mundi, which was the main teaching chart that ancient astrologers used. So it was the gateway of mankind. And in that portal of life, the god that is associated with will and violence and competition and death is in its fall, right? Because it's at odds with the moon, and this picks up on the basic opposition between Saturn and the moon. Mars has more kind of productive affinity with Saturn in this case than it does with the moon. So you don't necessarily want the god of death, violence, destruction, strife, as well as competition, dominance, etc. Mars is a malefic. You can't take the Mars out of Mars. Sometimes you can kind of use Mars in a better way, but all you have to do is reflect on the thin line between one's own sense of will and ego, one's own sense of willfulness and arrogance or pride or recklessness in your own life, to see what a thin line it is with Mars. So Mars a little bit more difficult in that place where life is exalted. Now that's where Jupiter is exalted. Cancer is where Jupiter is exalted and Mars is depressed. Well, Jupiter, the sign of abundance, proliferation, and life, of wholeness, of expansiveness, really rejoices in the sign through which life is coming in and growing and flourishing and being nourished. So Jupiter is exalted in Cancer, and there's a lot more I could say about that. Whereas Jupiter will be in its fall in Capricorn, where Jupiter is more like spring or summer, right? It's a very fertile planet. It's connected to growth. Whereas you put it in the winter sign, and it's like trying to grow in a dry, cold, austere environment. And so also, if our spirituality is too austere and it doesn't have enough life-giving nourishment in it, enough enthusiasm, enough positivity, buoyancy, light, happiness, etc., well, we're not very happy, are we? So it goes in both directions. A lot of the times I think that people don't like ancient astrology because they feel like it's really Saturnine, as in kind of cold, distanced, stoic, detached, and they want to be like right in the thick of their life a little bit more. And the and and that's a very valid criticism that ancient astrologers need to take really seriously. And basically, again, I think what it comes down to is it's not the language, it's how you use it. At any rate, Jupiter and Saturn conjunctions were great conjunctions when you look at their oppositions in this exaltation versus this fall. Exaltation of Jupiter in Cancer versus the fall in Capricorn, where it is currently. The Jupiter dynamic, it has a lot to do with the sense of everything cohering as a unified moral cosmos. And society should reflect that moral cosmos, which is why the progenitors of astrology in the West, like Plato and Pythagoras and the Egyptians and Indian astrologers and so forth, were coming from a society that basically placed the philosophers and the priests at the top. Granted, there were issues with these systems. They didn't give enough attention to women, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea behind Jupiter being at the sort of being at the top of the society means that they believe that society and the cosmos should reflect goodness, truth, beauty, order, wholeness, etc. Plato says that reality is both beautiful, true, good, and just. That's Jupiter. On the other hand, in Indian astrology and in ancient Western astrology, there are ages and cycles of ages of light and dark, so that even the most just society, the society that seems to be the most elevated, ultimately is impermanent and not perfect and will fall apart, as does everything in the material universe. And so we'll have dark ages, followed by light ages, followed by dark ages cyclically. And the struggle of humankind will always be to try to approximate the images of society in the world with what we think the highest good is, while always recognizing that there is impermanence and decay, that we can't hold on to or perfectly realize the ideal in this world. And that's a Saturn-Jupiter dynamic in the ancient philosophy of astrology. So Saturn and Jupiter have this tension going on in the exaltation and depression relationship of Jupiter in Cancer versus Capricorn, where it is currently. The point behind all of this is not so much to teach you anything specific about dignities, and definitely not to have the final word about dignities. I like so many of the things that my colleagues have said about the dignities that I've learned about over the years and continue to learn about that expand my understanding. So everything I'm saying about them specifically or in charts or anything like this is in a sense just my own commentary as a practicing professional. But it's my very deep belief that to summarize everything we've talked about today, that the language of dignities, again, is meant to describe the conditions, the karmic kshetra, the playing field that we're dealing with. And ultimately, the point of astrology, as you could see from those passages, is to ennoble a soul to be oneself and to define one's happiness, not so much by what the astrology is describing around us, but of who we discover ourselves to be as we forge a relationship with it. And that's why we need that language, because it's just as objective in some ways. It has to be just as objective as the weather. We have to be able to say there's a big crappy storm coming, and oh, looks like there's some great sunshine after that, or whatever. But we also have to know very well that this world we're very clever beings, and oftentimes we can get amazing deep meaning out of rainstorms, and a lot of the time we can do really crappy stuff in the light of day, right? So ultimately the language is not prescriptive, it's descriptive. And but the soul is beyond description. In fact, Heraclitus, who was one of the grandfathers philosophically, you could say, of like a lot of this tradition is like the Lao Tzu of the Western tradition. Of course, Lao Tzu, the writer of the Tao Te Ching. Um, Heraclitus said, the soul is explored forever to a depth beyond report. And beyond report, I mean beyond whether you've got a good astrologer or a bad astrologer reading your chart. You know what I mean? It's beyond whether you've got Venus in this sign or that sign. It's beyond whether you're empowered or disempowered. Your soul has no beginning and has no end. In fact, Indian astrologers said that the karma of this world was anadi, which means beginningless. It's without beginning. So are we, you know what I mean? And we have to cling to that idea. The soul is explored forever to a depth beyond report. No astrological report can make you better, and no astrological report can make you worse. The true work of the language of essential dignities, the true use of them, should be to accurately but encouragingly help us understand the karmic environment that we're living in the past, right now, or in the future, without making a person afraid, without making a person feel powerless, but also without falsely empowering a person and getting them attached to good things while there's a festering secret aversion to bad things beneath. So we have to be very careful of all of those things. And again, at the end of the day, people like myself who practice Hellenistic astrology and ancient astrology will use this language, but oftentimes not use it at all with clients. So that's the other thing. One last thing I guess you could say is that in modern astrology, so much of this lingo is used in a kind of democratic way. It's like, well, this is everyone's language and everyone should be using it in the same way. But in ancient astrology, it's a bit more like, you could say, acupuncture or Ayurveda, where it's like, yeah, the language is meant for practitioners, not necessarily meant for neophytes who are just looking at their chart for the first time. I don't mean to disrespect by that. It's just like, you know, it's like, have you ever freaked yourself out by looking at WebMD before? You know, like you've got like a cut on your hand and there's like a little tinge of some color you've never seen before. And you're like, oh my God, what is that? And then before you know it, you've got the rarest disease in the world from, you know, some magical, some magical thing that could only be picked up had you been in the rainforest or something. And now you're convinced you have it. So similarly, like we have to be very careful, because the language of dignities is meant for serious students and practitioners of astrology, in my opinion. And lay people need like people who are just learning astrology, they take this, they look at the charts, you can really freak them out. So you have to be really careful in how you explain it and how you delineate it and things like that. And the language may not be meant in some ways for casual people who are listening to casual forecasts and stuff like that, unless the astrologer is taking the time to explain the multivalence of the dignity. And it's not just a dignity. Remember, it's dignity chains. This planet Venus is in the sun's sign, but where is the sun? Oh, the sun is in its fall in Libra, or the sun is exalted in Aries, or whatever. That it totally changes the landscape of the mixture that you're creating. And the mixtures are really rich. The more you go beyond just one level of the dignity, you start tracing out triplicity rulers, decan rulers, term rulers. When you start painting with everything in the toolkit, it's like, my God, it's freaking beautiful. And in my opinion, again, I don't want to be harsh here, but people who dismiss it as ignorant or outdated or whatever, most of the time, because I was there myself, just haven't studied it enough. And I feel like if they give it a chance, they'll really like it. At worst, if people continue to denounce it without studying it, then I tend to say, well, that's just unfortunate for them, because they have an ignorant opinion. They've formed, it's like, it would be like me saying, oh, modern, it would be like me saying something like, again, like acupuncture, Ayurveda, or even like, say, Native American rituals or something that has a long history, that's been passed down through millenniums, is somehow in need of repair. And it's like, well, what do you think it needs? Why does it need repairing? And I'm only able to say, oh, well, because the past sucks compared to now. It's like, well, that's incredibly disrespectful to the heritage of these people, especially if you've never studied it, especially if you've never gone back and actually taken the time to learn the intricacies of the thing that you're criticizing. So at any rate, that's my appeal to everyone out there who is interested in the language, is, learn about it. And maybe you'll never use the language ever, but I promise you that if you learn about all the intricacies of the metaphysics and how this whole system was put together, that you will you'll have a deeper appreciation for it, and you'll at least respect that there are people out there who are doing their due diligence to try to use it in a good way. So that's what I wanted to say today about this. And again, all respect to this astrologer who's, I don't know at all, and I don't know his work. I can't judge anything about him, other than to say that it's my hope that, as there's been a lot of debate around this and so forth, and I had students asking me about it and so forth, that that I would just put something out that could hopefully represent some of both my empathy and sympathy. Like, I get it. I get why people could look at this language and go like, that seems crappy. And why would you ever want to, make people feel bad about themselves? But hopefully in this response also clarifies some of the reasons why this language is also beautiful and can be used to good effect. So, all right, that's what I've got for you guys today. I hope that this was interesting and gave you some good things to think about, some philosophy of astrology, essential dignities, stuff like that. If you ever want to learn more about it, my next program, registration opens in March for my next program, Ancient Astrology for the Modern Mystic. It starts in June and runs for a whole year. There's 30 classes, 12 guest lectures. It's a great program for people who want to start learning how to read natal charts, studying this ancient astrology, but also trying to make it applicable to the world that we live in today. So that's what I've got. I hope you have a great rest of your week. I'll be back again soon with more content, a lot of cool planetary transits to catch up with. So, okay, take care, everyone. Bye.